She looked at me at my husband's funeral and whispered, "I hope Eleanor has a backup plan. She's going to need one." I said nothing. I simply folded the funeral program in my hands and stared at the name printed across the front. Harold Whitmore, my husband of 43 years. The man who had built a life with me one careful step at a time. The man they had buried only 30 minutes earlier. I'm 71 years old, and I have learned something about people. Some wait until your strongest protector is gone before they show you who they really are. The funeral service was held in a small stone church just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Harold had always loved the mountains. He used to say the Blue Ridge skyline made every problem feel smaller. That morning the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars, dark suits, and people carrying casseroles they would later leave untouched in my kitchen. Everyone seemed eager to talk about Harold. Few seemed interested in talking to me. I noticed it immediately. The way conversations stopped when I approached. The way certain relatives offered me sympathetic smiles that felt rehearsed. The way my daughter-in-law Vanessa guided people away whenever they tried to ask me questions directly. She moved through the crowd like she was hosting the event. Perfect black dress. Perfect makeup. Perfect tears whenever someone was looking. I watched her from across the fellowship hall after the service ended. She stood beside my son Ethan, accepting condolences as though they were the grieving center of the family. Ethan looked exhausted. Vanessa looked focused. There is a difference. A volunteer from the church handed me a paper cup of coffee. I thanked her and glanced around the room. That was when I noticed my seat. Every table near the front was occupied by family members. Vanessa sat with Ethan, the grandchildren, several cousins, and a few business associates Harold had known for years. My place card sat alone at a small round table near the back wall beside the coat rack. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Eleanor Whitmore. Widow. The title seemed heavier than the paper beneath it. I carried my coffee over and sat down without complaint. Across the room, I heard laughter. Then I heard a voice I recognized. Vanessa's friend Claire. "I just hope she'll be okay financially," Claire said quietly. "Medical bills must have drained everything." Another woman nodded. "At least Ethan can help her sell the house if it comes to that." Vanessa lowered her eyes and sighed dramatically. "We're doing what we can." Several people shook their heads sympathetically. I almost smiled. They spoke about me as though I weren't 20 feet away, as though I couldn't hear every word, as though I had already become an obligation rather than a person. I looked down at my coffee. It had gone cold. Funny how quickly things change. For decades, Harold and I hosted holiday dinners, family reunions, birthdays, graduation parties. People filled our home. They laughed at our table. They praised Harold's success and admired the life we built. Yet somehow the moment he was gone, they began measuring what remained. Not memories. Not loyalty. Money. Property. Inheritance. Future opportunities. I noticed Vanessa glance toward me. For a second our eyes met. She offered a smile. It was polite. Controlled. Calculated. Then she turned back to her conversation. I could almost see the assumptions forming around me. Poor Eleanor. Alone now. Vulnerable. Probably worried about paying bills. Probably wondering how long she could keep the house. They thought they understood my situation because I never corrected them. I never mentioned the meeting Harold arranged months before he passed away. I never mentioned the documents locked inside our safe. And I certainly never mentioned the $28 million that only two people in that room knew existed. One of them was me. The other would arrive tomorrow morning with a leather briefcase and answers that would change everything. The house felt unfamiliar when I returned that evening. Not because anything had changed, but because Harold was no longer there to fill the quiet spaces between the walls. For 43 years, I had measured time by the sounds of our life together. The morning coffee brewing before sunrise. The newspaper folding open at the kitchen table. The television humming softly in the den while he pretended not to fall asleep in his favorite chair. Now there was only silence. I hung my black coat in the front closet and stood in the foyer longer than necessary. The sympathy flowers from the funeral had already begun arriving. White lilies, roses, cards filled with carefully chosen words about loss and faith and remembrance. I thanked each sender silently as I passed. Then I made my way to the kitchen and switched on the small lamp above the sink. The soft yellow light spread across the countertops. For the first time all day, I could finally breathe. Funerals are strange. People gather to honor one person, but often reveal far more about themselves. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals. The same table where he had looked at me 6 months earlier with an expression I had never seen before. Concern. Not for himself. For me. At the time, his health had already begun declining. Nothing dramatic. Just small changes. Less energy. More appointments. More quiet moments where he seemed lost in thought. One evening, he folded his hands on the table and asked a question that caught me off guard. Eleanor, if something happened to me, would you be all right? I remember laughing softly. You are not going anywhere. But he did not smile. Instead, he stared out the window toward the maple trees behind the house. Promise me something, he said. When people show you who they are, believe them. I did not understand what he meant then. I was beginning to understand now. My phone buzzed on the table. A text message from Ethan. Vanessa and I are stopping by tomorrow afternoon. We should discuss the house and some financial matters. I read the message twice. Not because it surprised me, because it arrived so quickly. Harold had been buried only hours earlier. Already they wanted to discuss assets, property, plans. I set the phone down without replying. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. I could hear branches brushing softly against one another. Harold used to love that sound. He said it. Reminded him that even strong things bend when necessary. I finished my water and walked upstairs. Our bedroom door stood partially open. For a moment I hesitated before entering. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. A novel sat face down beside them, a bookmark forever trapped halfway through the final chapter. I reached out and touched the frame of a photograph taken 20 years earlier. Harold was smiling at the camera. I was standing beside him with my arm linked through his. We looked ordinary, happy, secure, the kind of couple people assume will always have more time. My eyes drifted toward the antique writing desk in the corner of the room. The desk had belonged to Harold's father. Most people saw an old piece of furniture. Harold saw history. Inside the bottom drawer sat a small brass key. The key opened a safe hidden behind a painting downstairs in his study. I had not touched it since his passing. Not yet. But tomorrow would change that. Tomorrow morning, Richard Bell would arrive exactly as promised. He had served as Harold's attorney for nearly 3 decades. Reliable, discreet, the sort of man who never wasted words. The sort of man who did not make unnecessary visits. Whatever Harold had arranged, Richard knew the details. I looked out the bedroom window toward the dark backyard. Somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the quiet streets of our neighborhood, people were already making assumptions about my future. They thought they understood the situation. They thought they knew what Harold had left behind. Most of all, they believed I needed saving. I switched off the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time that day, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because I was happy, not because I was no longer grieving, but because tomorrow, the first piece of the truth would finally come into the light. Richard Bell arrived at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning. Some people become part of a family's history without ever sharing a last name. Richard was one of those people. He had handled Harold's legal affairs for nearly 30 years. He attended birthdays, retirement parties, and charity events. He knew where every important document was kept and remembered details most people would have forgotten decades ago. When I opened the front door, he offered a gentle smile and held a leather briefcase in one hand. "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" he asked. It was a simple question, but unlike everyone else, he seemed to genuinely want the answer. 1 hour at a time, I said. He nodded. That is usually the best approach. I led him into Harold's study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar wood and old books. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and stretched across the desk where Harold had spent countless evenings reviewing reports and writing notes. Richard placed his briefcase on the desk and removed a thick folder. Then he looked directly at me. Before we discuss anything else, Harold left very specific instructions. My heart tightened slightly. Even after 43 years together, my husband still had surprises waiting for me. Richard opened the folder and carefully organized several documents. 6 months ago, Harold requested a complete review of his estate structure. I frowned. Why did he not tell me? Richard adjusted his glasses. Because he believed certain family members would behave differently if they knew the full picture. The room became very quiet. Outside, a bird landed on the feeder near the window. Inside, I could hear only the ticking of Harold's grandfather clock. Richard slid a document toward me. He wanted to protect you. I looked down at the page. Legal language filled every line. Trust agreements, asset schedules, ownership transfers, details that seemed almost unreal at first glance. Richard began explaining each section patiently. Over the years, Harold had moved investments, business interests, and several properties into structures designed to provide long-term protection. Nothing improper, nothing secret from the law, simply careful planning. The kind of planning successful people make when they spend decades building something valuable. By the time Richard finished, I sat back in my chair and stared at the papers. $28 million. Even knowing Harold's business success, seeing the actual number written on paper felt different. He never cared about displaying wealth, Richard said quietly. Most people assumed he was comfortable. Very few understood how successful he truly became. I thought about the conversations I had overheard at the funeral. The worried expressions, the assumptions, the pity. It almost seemed absurd now. Richard closed one folder and opened another. There is something else. I looked up. What? He hesitated for a moment. Harold specifically instructed that no information regarding the trust be disclosed until after a formal family meeting. I already knew where this was heading. Ethan and Vanessa. Richard nodded. He wanted to observe their intentions before final disclosures occurred. A memory surfaced immediately. Vanessa offering to help manage my finances before anyone even knew what finances existed. Ethan texting about the house less than a day after the funeral. Harold had seen something long before I did. Richard handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Harold's handwriting. The sight of it nearly took my breath away. He asked me to give this to you personally, Richard said. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single page. Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I was right about one thing. People reveal themselves when they think there is something to gain. Listen carefully. Watch quietly. Do not rush. The truth always arrives on its own schedule. Trust yourself. And remember that I never doubted you for a second. I read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it back into the envelope. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard checked his watch. The family meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I nodded slowly. Tomorrow, less than 48 hours after the funeral. I already suspected what kind of conversation Ethan and Vanessa planned to have. The difference was that now I knew something they did not. And for the first time since Harold's passing, I felt completely prepared to listen. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly, but my mind kept returning to the same question. When had Vanessa started seeing me as an obstacle instead of family? The answer, I realized, was probably years ago. Some changes happen so gradually that you do not notice them until you look back. I first met Vanessa 15 years earlier at a charity dinner in Charlotte. Ethan had been dating her for less than 6 months. She was charming, polished, and quick with compliments. Harold liked her immediately. I wanted to like her too. At the beginning, there was no obvious reason not to. She remembered birthdays. She brought flowers when she visited. She laughed at Harold's stories and asked thoughtful questions. Looking back now, I think what impressed everyone most was how easily she adapted herself to whatever people wanted to see. After Ethan proposed, she became part of the family quickly. Holiday dinners, summer cookouts, weekend visits. Everything appeared normal. Yet over time, small things began to change. They were never dramatic enough to confront. Just small moments that left an uncomfortable feeling behind. One Thanksgiving, I learned about a family gathering only after seeing photographs online. Vanessa apologized and blamed a misunderstanding. Another year, Ethan stopped calling every Sunday, then every other Sunday. Eventually, weeks would pass without a conversation. There was always an explanation. Work was busy. The children had activities. Life was complicated. I accepted every reason because I trusted my son. Harold noticed it before I did. One evening after Ethan canceled another visit, Harold sat quietly on the porch and watched the sunset. You make excuses for people because you see the best in them, he told me. That is one of the things I love about you. But it is also why people sometimes disappoint you. At the time, I thought he was being overly protective. Now I wondered if he had already seen the pattern developing. Vanessa rarely challenged me directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she operated through distance. Invitations that arrived late. Decisions made without asking my opinion. Family plans discussed after they were finalized. One small exclusion at a time. The result was subtle but effective. I remained part of the family while somehow becoming less important within it. The grandchildren. still loved me. That never changed. Emma and Jacob always ran to hug me whenever I visited. Yet even there, I noticed a shift. School events happened without my knowledge. Vacations were planned without mentioning dates. Important moments reached me secondhand. The realization hurt more than I liked to admit. Not because I felt entitled to every detail. Because family had always mattered deeply to me. Harold understood that. He built his entire life around protecting the people he loved, which was why his actions during the last year of his life suddenly made more sense. He had not reorganized his affairs because he expected financial trouble. He had done it because he understood human nature. He knew money reveals character the same way pressure reveals cracks in a foundation. Late that afternoon, I walked into Harold's study again. The envelope containing his letter rested inside the desk drawer where I had placed it earlier. I opened it and reread one sentence. People reveal themselves when they think there is something to gain. The words felt different now, less like advice, more like a warning. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway. I looked through the front window and immediately recognized Ethan's truck. He was arriving a day earlier than expected. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat. Even from inside the house, I could see the determined expression on her face. They were not here for a casual visit. They had come with a purpose. I smoothed the front of my sweater, took a slow breath, and walked toward the door. For years, I had ignored small signs because I wanted peace. Today, for the first time, I was ready to pay attention. When I opened the front door, Ethan immediately stepped forward and hugged me. For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who once followed Harold through hardware stores and asked 100 questions before breakfast. Then he stepped back, and the distance returned. Vanessa offered a sympathetic smile and carried a bakery box in both hands. "We brought your favorite lemon cake," she said. It was an odd gesture. Vanessa had never remembered my favorite dessert before. "That was thoughtful," I replied. I led them into the kitchen. The three of us sat around the same table where Harold and I had spent decades building our life together. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Ethan cleared his throat first. "Mom, we have been worried about you." I nodded. "That is kind of you." Vanessa folded her hands carefully. "You have been through so much. Losing Harold, managing the house alone, dealing with all the expenses that come afterward." There it was. The conversation had arrived exactly where I expected it to. Not grief. Not memories. Not family. Expenses. I poured coffee for everyone and waited. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Ethan before continuing. "This house is beautiful, but it is a lot for one person. The property taxes alone must be overwhelming." I stirred my coffee slowly. "I have managed so far." Ethan leaned forward. "Maybe for now, but long term, you should think about simplifying things." Simplifying. Another interesting word. Over the years, I had noticed how people often wrapped self-interest inside language that sounded helpful. Simplify. Assist. Protect. Support. The words sounded generous until you examined what they actually meant. Vanessa reached across the table and touched Ethan's arm. "We just want what is best for you." I smiled politely. "Of course." She seemed encouraged by my calm response. "There are some wonderful communities nearby. Places with activities, security, transportation. You would not have to worry about maintaining a large property anymore." I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "That is a very specific solution." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We have simply been discussing possibilities." Ethan shifted in his chair. "Mom, nobody is trying to pressure you." The moment he said it, I knew pressure was exactly what they intended. Not today, perhaps, but eventually. The conversation continued for another half hour. Vanessa mentioned maintenance costs 3 separate times. Ethan brought up the real estate market twice. Neither one asked what I wanted. Neither one asked whether Harold and I had already made plans. They spoke as though the future had already been decided, and they were merely helping me accept it. Finally, Vanessa stood and carried empty coffee cups to the sink. She believed I could not hear her when she spoke quietly to Ethan near the counter. "If she waits too long, the house will become a problem." Ethan lowered his voice. "Give it time." "Time changes nothing," she replied. "The sooner she moves, the easier this will be." I stared into my coffee and said nothing. A few minutes later, they gathered their things and prepared to leave. At the front door, Ethan hugged me again. "We love you, Mom." "I know," I said. It was the truth. Love can exist alongside weakness. Love can exist alongside poor decisions. Vanessa adjusted her coat and smiled warmly. Think about what we said. I will, I replied. After they drove away, I remained standing in the doorway watching their truck disappear down the street. Then I returned to the kitchen and noticed something sitting on the table. Vanessa had accidentally left behind a folder. I walked over and picked it up. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words preliminary property evaluation. Beneath that was my address. I carried the folder into Harold's study and closed the door behind me. For a long moment, I simply stood there staring at the cover page. Preliminary property evaluation. My address. My home. The place where Ethan had taken his first steps. The place where Harold and I celebrated anniversaries, hosted holidays, and weathered every season of our marriage. Vanessa had not forgotten this folder by accident. Or perhaps she had. Either way, it revealed far more than she intended. I sat behind Harold's desk and opened it carefully. Inside were market estimates, renovation projections, and notes from a local real estate consultant. Several pages had highlighted figures in yellow marker. There were even handwritten comments in the margins. Most of them were practical. One of them stopped me cold. Property should move quickly once Eleanor agrees. Not if. Once. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The confidence behind those words told me everything. They were not exploring possibilities. They were planning outcomes. Somehow, somewhere, Vanessa had already convinced herself that my future was hers to organize. I placed the papers neatly back into the folder and locked it inside the desk drawer. Then I walked downstairs and made myself a cup of tea. Harold used to say that important decisions should never be made in anger. Tea first, decisions later. The familiar ritual settled my thoughts. By the time I carried the cup to the living room, the hurt I felt had transformed into clarity. There is a difference between concern and control. Concern asks questions. Control arrives with answers before questions are ever asked. Around noon, my phone rang. Richard Bell. I thought you should know something before tomorrow's meeting, he said. His tone was calm, but deliberate. What is it? I asked. Several family members have contacted my office this week. That did not surprise me. Including Ethan? A brief pause followed. Including Ethan. And Vanessa. I stared out the window toward the backyard. What did they want? Information. Richard chose the word carefully. Mostly about estate timelines, ownership structures, and asset distribution. I almost laughed. Harold had not even been gone a full week. Did you tell them anything? Absolutely not. His voice hardened slightly. I informed them that all discussions would take place during the scheduled family meeting. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The funeral conversations, the pressure about the house, the property evaluation folder, the calls to Richard's office. None of it was isolated. It was a pattern, and patterns tell the truth more reliably than words ever do. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the painting that concealed the safe in Harold's study. For years, it had simply existed in the background of our lives. Now it felt different, significant. I opened the safe and carefully removed several folders Richard had reviewed the day before. Investment reports, trust documents, ownership records, page after page confirming what Harold had built over decades. Not flashy wealth, not lottery money, something much more substantial. Disciplined wealth, patient wealth, the kind that grows quietly while everyone else is paying attention to appearances. I smiled as I returned the documents to the safe. Vanessa believed she understood power because she recognized expensive cars and large houses. Harold understood power differently. He understood preparation. The next morning would bring the family meeting. Vanessa would arrive confident. Ethan would likely believe he was helping solve practical problems. Both of them expected a conversation centered around my limitations. Neither one realized the conversation was about to center on my choices. And for the first time since Harold's passing, I found myself sleeping peacefully. The family meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon at Richard Bell's office downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early, not because I was nervous, because Harold had always believed that arriving early showed respect for other people's time. Some habits remain long after the person who taught them is gone. Richard greeted me in the reception area and led me into a private conference room. A polished oak table occupied the center of the room. Leather chairs surrounded it. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Everything about the room felt calm and deliberate. The opposite of what I suspected was about to happen. Ethan and Vanessa arrived exactly on time. Vanessa entered first carrying a leather portfolio. Ethan followed behind her. Both smiled warmly when they saw me. The performance was polished, almost convincing. We exchanged greetings and took our seats. Richard remained standing near the head of the table. Several folders rested neatly in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Today we will review certain matters related to Harold's estate and discuss next steps." Vanessa immediately leaned forward. "We appreciate everything you are doing, Richard." Her tone was friendly, but eager. Richard nodded politely. "Of course." For the first 20 minutes, the discussion focused on routine matters. Final expenses, administrative procedures, legal filings. Vanessa listened carefully. Occasionally, she glanced at Ethan before making notes inside her portfolio. Then the conversation shifted. "Exactly as I expected. One issue we should discuss," Vanessa said, "is making sure Eleanor is properly supported moving forward." Richard folded his hands. "What specifically do you mean?" Vanessa smiled sympathetically. "Well, she is alone now. The house is large. Maintenance costs are increasing everywhere. We simply want to ensure she has the resources she needs." Ethan nodded. "We are concerned about her future." Concern. There was that word again. Richard turned toward me. "Eleanor, would you like to comment?" I shook my head slightly. "I am listening." Vanessa seemed encouraged. "We have researched several options that might reduce financial pressure." Financial pressure. The phrase almost made me laugh. Instead, I remained silent. Richard's expression never changed. "What options?" he asked. Vanessa opened her portfolio and removed several papers. "Downsizing would free up capital. There are also retirement communities nearby that provide excellent services." She slid the documents across the table. The same proposal. The same plan. Only now it was happening in front of witnesses. Richard glanced briefly at the papers before setting them aside. "Interesting." Vanessa smiled confidently. "We only want what is best for her." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard looked directly at me. "Eleanor, are you experiencing financial difficulties?" The question hung in the air. Ethan looked concerned. Vanessa looked prepared. I looked at Richard. "No," I answered calmly. Vanessa blinked. "Only once. But I noticed." "Well," she said carefully, "perhaps not today. We are simply trying to think long-term." Richard nodded slowly. "Long-term planning is certainly important." He opened one of the folders in front of him. Across the table, Vanessa straightened slightly. Ethan shifted in his chair. Something in Richard's tone had changed. The room felt different now. More focused. More precise. Richard removed several documents and arranged them neatly. Then he looked directly at Vanessa and Ethan. "Before any future planning discussions continue," he said, "there is information regarding Harold's arrangements that all relevant parties should understand." For the first time since arriving, Vanessa's confidence faltered. Only slightly, but enough. I sat quietly and folded my hands in my lap. Harold's letter echoed in my memory. "Watch quietly. Do not rush. The truth always arrives on its own schedule." As Richard opened the next folder, I realized that schedule had finally arrived. Richard opened the folder and removed a document that appeared far less impressive than everyone expected. No dramatic announcement. No theatrical pause. Just paper. Quiet, ordinary paper. Yet I had lived long enough to understand that some of the most important moments in life arrive without any fanfare at all. Several years ago, Richard began. Harold undertook a comprehensive restructuring of his personal holdings, investments, and estate planning arrangements. Vanessa's attention sharpened immediately. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Richard continued in the same calm tone. The purpose was to ensure stability, privacy, and long-term protection. Vanessa smiled politely. "That sounds very responsible." "It was," Richard replied. He slid a copy of one document toward Ethan and another toward Vanessa. Both lowered their eyes to read. At first, neither reacted. Then I noticed Vanessa's expression change. Not dramatically, just enough. Her confidence seemed to hesitate. Richard continued. "Certain assets are not part of the conventional probate process. They are held separately through structures established during Harold's lifetime." Ethan frowned. "I am not sure I understand." Richard nodded. "That is perfectly normal. Most people are unfamiliar with these arrangements." He opened another folder. "What matters is that Harold made very specific decisions regarding ownership, management authority, and future control." The room became completely silent. Outside the conference room windows, traffic moved through the city as if nothing unusual was happening. Inside, every word suddenly carried weight. Vanessa carefully set her papers down. Are you saying the estate is more complicated than expected? Richard offered a professional smile. I am. Saying Harold planned very carefully. Ethan looked toward me. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Not greed. Not calculation. Confusion. Genuine confusion. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Richard removed another document and placed it in front of me. Eleanor, would you please confirm receipt of this trust administration summary? I signed where indicated and returned the page. Vanessa watched the exchange closely. Trust administration, she repeated. Richard nodded. Yes. Another silence followed. Vanessa attempted to recover her composure. Well, regardless of legal structures, I am sure everyone wants what is best for the family. It was a reasonable statement. The kind people make when they sense a conversation moving beyond their control. Richard folded his hands. That depends on how one defines best. Vanessa blinked. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then Richard opened the final folder. Unlike the others, it contained only a few pages. He reviewed them briefly before looking directly at everyone seated at the table. There is one final matter that must be clarified before any future planning discussions take place. My heart remained steady. I already knew what was coming. Ethan did not. Vanessa certainly did not. Richard adjusted his glasses and spoke with complete precision. The primary trust established by Harold Whitmore became fully active upon his passing. Under its terms, sole authority, sole discretion, and sole control belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Ethan stared at him. Vanessa sat perfectly still. Richard continued. All major assets connected to the trust fall under her direction. No transfers, sales, distributions, or management decisions occur without her approval. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The silence stretched across the conference room like a slowly rising tide. Vanessa finally forced a smile. And what exactly does the trust contain? Richard looked down at the final page. Then he looked back up. That, he said calmly, is the next item we need to discuss. Richard looked down at the final page and spoke without drama. The trust currently contains assets with an estimated value of $28 million. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the sounds from the hallway outside seemed to disappear. Ethan stared at Richard as though he had misheard him. Vanessa's expression remained frozen for several seconds before she finally blinked. 28 million? She asked quietly. Richard nodded. Approximately. Vanessa looked at me, then back at Richard, then at me again. For the first time since Harold's funeral, she seemed unable to find the right words. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Dad never mentioned anything like that. Very few people knew, Richard replied. That was intentional. The silence returned. I sat calmly with my hands folded in my lap. Not because I was enjoying their reaction, because Harold had prepared me for this moment. Wealth changes conversations. It changes assumptions. Most importantly, it exposes motivations that people work very hard to hide. Vanessa cleared her throat. I had no idea. It was probably the most honest thing she had said all week. Richard continued reviewing the documents. Investment accounts, commercial properties, business interests, long-term holdings accumulated over decades. Every page revealed another piece of the life Harold had quietly built. By the time he finished, Ethan looked overwhelmed. Vanessa looked stunned. Neither of them mentioned retirement communities. Neither of them mentioned downsizing. Neither of them mentioned property taxes. Funny how quickly certain concerns disappear. Eventually, Ethan turned toward me. Mom, why did you not tell us? His voice was not angry. It sounded wounded. I thought carefully before answering. Because nobody asked how I was doing. They only asked what I was going to do. Ethan lowered his eyes. Across the table, Vanessa remained silent. Richard closed the final folder. As I explained earlier, Eleanor has complete authority regarding all trust decisions. Vanessa finally spoke. So everything belongs to her. Richard answered immediately. Everything is controlled by her. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Less tense. More revealing. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Papers were collected. Signatures were completed. Chairs moved back from the table. The practical work was finished. Yet the most important part had nothing to do with documents. It was the truth that had surfaced along the way. As we walked toward the elevator, Ethan stopped beside me. Mom, I am sorry if I made you feel pressured. I looked at him carefully. He was still my son. Flawed. Influenced. Sometimes weak. But still my son. I know, I said softly. Just remember something. People do not become valuable because of what they own. They become valuable because of how they treat others when ownership is not part of the conversation. Ethan nodded slowly. I am not sure he fully understood, but I think he would eventually. Vanessa stood several feet away waiting near the elevator doors. For once, she had nothing to say. No suggestions. No plans. No solutions. Just silence. Later that evening, I returned home and sat alone on the back porch. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath the fading sunset. The same view Harold loved. The same view we had shared for years. I thought about the funeral. The whispers. The pity. The assumptions. People had looked at me and seen a helpless widow struggling to survive. They never imagined I was the one person in the room who had nothing to prove. A cool breeze moved through the trees. I smiled and looked toward the horizon. Harold had been right. The truth arrives on its own schedule. At his funeral, they treated me like I had nothing left. What they never understood was that the greatest thing Harold left behind was not $28 million. It was the wisdom to recognize who people become when they think you have none.